My fellow Americans, for centuries, great people have run this nation showing amazing leadership skills. For example, George Washington, one of the greatest American generals of all time, fought against the British for their freedom back in the late 1700s. After his big success, he eventually became the first ever president of the United States. Also, there's Abraham Lincoln, who led this great nation to piece itself back together during the Civil War. They are revered to be great leaders, but one man, one of the most beloved men in American history, has changed the world with his wife Eleanor, and with their leadership they faced many struggles. When he won the 1932 election, the country was on the rise of the Great Depression. But with his leadership, he instituted the New Deal, a collection of policies geared to get his country back on its feet.
Well, certainly facing the Great Depression, 1,000 banks closing a day, 25% of the people unemployed, that was a huge, huge challenge to face.
The President began this campaign with the same attitude with which he has approached so many of the serious problems of the past 3 years. He sought to create the impression that there was no campaign on at all, just as he had sought to create the impression that all was well with the United States and that there was no depression.
By the end of the decade, his New Deal eventually became successful with policies such as the WPA and the CCC. Eleanor led to the nation as Franklin's eyes and ears.
Really appreciate even more the way that they did work as political partners. I mean, I knew that going in, but when you see it over and over in specific issues, the way in which, for example, he would use, they would sort of have her go out sometimes and make a speech about a subject, just to test public opinion. And it was very calculated, because if the reaction was negative, then FDR could claim, well, that's just Eleanor, that's her opinion, and he could sort of back away from an issue that maybe wasn't going to get a lot of public support. But if the reaction to a particular speech she made on a particular subject got a positive reaction, then he would know that that was something that he could possibly pursue in terms of legislation.
President Roosevelt was a very good politician. He's quoted once as saying, "I never let my left hand know what my right hand is doing." He would ask people to do certain things for him, not really telling other people to do other things, but kind of encouraging them other ways. When you get to political speeches, inaugural addresses and whatnot, he would have things set up so that he would already be there. Many people didn't know the extent of his paralysis, because when they got to the event, he'd already be there sitting.
As each of them led the nation in their own way, they were able to make this country successful economically and militarily to keep Americans hopeful throughout these tough times.
They each brought a considerable set of skills to the table. Franklin had the great ability to communicate. He liked people. He liked chatting with people. He had all kinds of great ideas. And Eleanor Roosevelt had many of those same qualities and was able to understand, people and the things that they needed in order to better their lives. So basically what they did was they understood people and they talked to people about what they were going to do to try to solve their problems. And that's where I think really where the leadership came from.
But on December 7th, 1941, disaster struck. The Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor.
Soldiers, children of Pearl Harbor, stabbed in the back. But remembering is not enough. Hating is not enough. Sacrifices. Yes, no matter what. And what do they ask of us, the heroes we mourn? What do they ask of us, our marching sons across the seas? To stand shoulder to shoulder with them, here at home to do the job of forging the guns of vengeance. They're marching now. The rhythm of our marching boys thrills the world.
The nation was in peril because Franklin had decided not to get involved in the Second World War, seeing how the First World War left the country. Eleanor told the nation of the horror that had happened through her radio show that night. Franklin went to Congress, furious that an American base was intentionally bombed, which left sailors and soldiers dead.
My fellow Americans, as you know, I have recently come back from a trip of inspection of camps and training stations and war factories. The main thing that I observed on this trip is not exactly news. It is the plain fact that the American people are united as never before in their determination to do a job and to do it well.
Though the public was isolationist and anti-war, Franklin had decided that America needed to go. Even though they declared war on Japan, they had to deal with Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party.
War had already been going on by the time the United States entered. It actually broke out in September of 1939, but quite frankly, it had been building even up to that point. Hitler had already taken over several countries even before war broke out. Similar situation in the Pacific. Japan had already begun its expansion and was taking over other islands and territories.
Franklin had many allies to support him in the war, such as Charles de Gaulle of France, Winston Churchill of England, and Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. But both Franklin and Eleanor had to run the country with their leadership, and they succeeded. To support the troops, Eleanor went to the Red Cross and other military hospitals worldwide to communicate with and support American troops.
What it was he was doing. She traveled for him on fact-finding missions, went around the country and got information, came back and reported to him.
FDR, though stricken with polio, still went to military bases as well to support his troops.
Really contribute both before we entered and after was our manpower and our ability to produce war material. And so we not only contributed hundreds of thousands of soldiers and sailors, we also contributed billions of dollars worth of tanks and planes and guns and ammunition.
Of the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps is rapidly instructed in the modern methods of defense and offense. All America is behind these armaments, supplying an uninterrupted flow of materials for machines of mechanized might.
Even though some American soldiers had to fight in Japan, America was still able to fight the Axis powers in Europe. But then, in 1945, FDR died unexpectedly.
There was an entire generation of people who knew no other president. So it shook both the nation and the world to the core, because here's a man who had seen the nation and led the nation through 12 years of depression and war. And most poignantly, we were on the verge of winning in Europe.
But before his passing, he had corresponded with Albert Einstein to create the atomic bomb, which was what started the Manhattan Project. When the American troops were told about Franklin's passing, they knew that they couldn't give up on the war. Once the Manhattan Project was finished, America bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which ultimately made the Japanese surrender. Soon after, the war was over and the United States rose as the victor, thanks to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our American hero.
His leadership and the decisiveness with which he could make decisions. He would soak up information from as many advisors as he could possibly get, then decide the best course of action, take that action, and then move on to the next thing. He didn't wallow, he didn't despair over his decisions, he didn't take time to write down every single thing he was thinking.
What I see in Franklin Roosevelt in terms of his leadership qualities that helped to explain his success as a president was, first of all, a supreme self-confidence. He had the ability to stake out a position, often a very bold position, and stick to it.
With his and Eleanor's leadership, their legacy still lives on today, which can be showed with the United States and Japan relying heavily on one another for economic and military purposes. To remember his legacy, FDR's friends and family created a memorial in Washington as well as in his hometown, Hyde Park. Even in tough times, both Franklin and Eleanor were able to stay strong leaders for this country. FDR isn't just our American hero. He is our beloved 32nd President of the United States, who will remain in the hearts and minds of many.
Whatever our individual circumstances or opportunities, we are all in it, and our spirit is good. And we Americans and our allies are going to win. And don't let anyone tell you anything different. That is the main thing that I saw on my trip around the country. Unbeatable spirit. If the leaders of Germany and Japan could have come along with me and had seen what I saw, they would agree with my conclusion.